Thank you all for being here. I'm sure we'll get a few more people trickling in, especially since I know that it's lunchtime and people are probably grabbing food. But this is GreenerU's webinar from compliance to action about building performance standards. So thank you all for joining. We will be here for about an hour today. We plan to present for 45 minutes to 50 minutes, and then we'll leave time for questions at the end. Feel free to also pop questions in the chat or in the Q&A during the meeting, and we can make sure we get to those first. All right, let me just figure out how PowerPoint works. Okay, so we have some amazing presenters today. I'm Madeline Rawson. I am the Manager of Planning and Customer Engagement at GreenerU, and I will pass it over to Aiden to introduce himself.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Aiden Callan. I'm the Burdo Program Manager at the City of Boston. Yeah, glad to be with you all. I'll pass it over to Morgan.
I'm Morgan Strong. I'm with GreenerU. I'm a project development engineer. And then Craig.
Hello all, Craig Altmos, Director of Strategic Partnerships here at GreenerU. I'll pass it back to Madeline.
Awesome, thank you. We also have our senior engineer, Simon, on the call, who is on deck to answer questions if you have any super technical questions after the webinar. Awesome. So just quickly about GreenerU, if you came to us through a different organization and they directed you here to this webinar, we are a firm that helps institutions navigate the pathways to decarbonization through planning, engineering, and construction. So we're able to facilitate stakeholder buy-in, help you develop goals and values, and then engineer solutions and then actually implement those. So I'm going to launch a quick poll here. It's only 3 questions just to kind of get a sense for who's in the room. And you should see that pop up. It's just a few questions about your type of institution, where you're located, so that we know, to focus on Burdo versus Elber, a little bit more in our later portion, and also about what your current level of knowledge about these topics are. All right, just a few more seconds. All right, so you should see the results on your screen. There are a lot of nonprofits here, along with some higher ed institutions and businesses. A lot of people are located in Massachusetts with a solid representation from Boston. And people generally seem to have a good understanding of building performance standards and decarbonization pathways and are really looking to turn that knowledge into action. So we will definitely get into that today. Briefly, I want to discuss some goals we have today. We're going to provide guidance on navigating building performance standards. Aiden will be presenting on that. Then we are going to discuss decarbonization pathways and explain some decarbonization strategies and translate some engineering jargon. Morgan will be covering that portion of today, and then Craig will share some financial and capacity building resources with us, specific to Boston and the greater Massachusetts area. And that's pretty much what the roadmap says. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Aiden, who will talk about Burdo reporting in 2026.
Okay, thank you, Madeline. All right, so we'll get right into it. Next slide. Okay, so back in 2017, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts signed on to the Paris Climate Agreement to say that, we are going to be carbon neutral by 2050. And so the city of Boston shares that goal. It's one thing to make the commitment. It's another to develop and implement policy um, to reach that goal as fairly and effectively as possible. Um, and so when, you know, determining how to actually reach this goal, if you look at Boston, 70% of Boston's total emissions come from its buildings. And 40% of Boston's total emissions come from the largest 5,000 or so buildings. And so a building performance standard policy is a new idea that many cities and states, other jurisdictions across the country are either implementing or taking a hard look at um, to get the building owners of those largest buildings thinking about how to reduce their emissions and get their buildings on track to meet those long-term goals. Next slide, please. So Berto buildings are residential buildings that have 15 or more units, non-residential that are 20,000 or more square feet, and that's gross floor area, so conditioned and unconditioned space, or any tax parcel with multiple buildings that sum to either of those amounts. Next slide. So Berto has been around since 2013. I think 2014 was the first year that building owners were required to report their data. So um, historically, it's been that, building owners, they gather their whole building energy and water data, um, and they benchmark that data and they report that data to the city. The city discloses that information publicly. Um, and the idea is, what you can measure, you can manage. So benchmarking is really a first step to taking better control over the energy efficiency and energy decisions moving forward. But back in 2021, Berto was amended, um, and that amendment introduced emissions limits to say starting in 2026 or 2031, depending on your building size, um, these buildings will not only have to report their data each year, but actually hit an emissions limit or emissions standard. And I'll get more into that on the next few slides. But in anticipation of that, third-party data verification became a requirement. Um, building owners, if they report their data, they have to be confident in the information that they're reporting. And so, to have a second set of eyes that is, an energy professional to look over the data that's been reported, check to make sure the square footage is accurate, the building use type is accurate, and that the energy use reported does in fact cover the entire building. It's a necessary component to this if building owners are to be able to plan with confidence and if we are to, accurately calculate the emissions tied to the building during those emissions compliance years. And again, this is in anticipation of hitting those emissions limits. If you go to the next slide here, there may be, some more info that pops up. And building owners can meet those emissions limits by focusing on energy efficiency and electrification practices, or taking advantage of renewable energy options, which I'll get into further. Or they can make an annual payment called an alternative compliance payment, which is collected and put into the Equitable Emissions Investment Fund, which is used to support local building decarbonization projects. Next slide. Okay, so I mentioned emissions standards or emissions limits. We kind of use these terms interchangeably. Um, a multi-family building uses energy very differently than a hospital, right? And so the the limits that you set really have to be realistic to what those buildings typically use. And so you'll see in that first column, that 2025 to 2029 range, the emissions limits vary based on building use type. And every 5 years, they decrease until we hit zero in 2050. So one thing to really keep in mind here, I really want to frame this well for folks so they have a good understanding of kind of what we're up against in these early years. Um, I'd say the vast majority of buildings, maybe 85 to 90% of buildings that are required to meet that 2025 emissions limit are already meeting it. So most building owners are looking out to 2030 or 2035 uh, before that emissions limit starts dropping more and more, and they have to plan for that future limit. So um, just want to note that most people are kind of in that boat, and those that are not meeting their emissions limit in these early years, I could take advantage of flexibility within the ordinance that I'll get into in a couple slides. Next slide, please. Okay, I briefly mentioned this before, but not every Berto building has to meet an emissions limit this year in 2026 based on 2025 data. Those smaller buildings, 15 to 34 units, 20,000 to 35,000 square feet, have a bit more runway, and they don't have to start meeting those limits until 2031 based on 2030 reported data. Next slide. Okay, so I would recommend definitely doing a deeper dive of this if you're curious, and we'll send out the slides afterwards. We have a renewable energy quick guide that details these further, but you know the there are still emissions tied to electricity usage. Um, but a building that is all efficient, all electric is well positioned to benefit from what we call the greening of the grid. So by law in Massachusetts, the electric grid is required to increase its renewable capacity by a few percentage points each year. So buildings that are all efficient, all electric are well positioned to kind of ride that grid decarbonization wave. But in the meantime, there are still emissions tied to that electricity usage. And if a building owner is above their emissions limit, one way that they can reduce their emissions to meet it is by potentially buying and retiring just enough mass class one RECs to to meet that limit. Enrolling in Boston Community Choice Electricity, the Green 100 option means that any electricity accounts that are enrolled in BCCE Green 100 are zero emissions under BERTO. They can enter into a qualified power purchase agreement or take advantage of local renewable energy through on-site solar or net metering credits. Next slide. Okay, so I mentioned a couple ways in which a building can meet its emissions limit if it's above it, but there are many circumstances within different building types, different ownership structures, different financial circumstances that the ordinance built in flexibility to account for. And so I'm not going to get too into the weeds on these, but I do want to give people an understanding of the flexibility that we're offering. So first off, a blended emission standard. This is the easiest one to take advantage of. If a building is 60% office and 40% lab, right? It defaults into that office building use type, right? It's by default held to that office building use type, which has an emissions limit, I think, of about 5.4 kilograms of CO2 per square foot per year. But they have 40% lab. So they would very much prefer to take a blend of those different building use types and be held to an emissions limit that is a number that is a blend of those use types. So upon reporting, building owners can select and opt in to a blended emission standard if it would benefit them, or they can decide to not opt into that. A building portfolio. So if a building owner has multiple buildings, multiple BERTO buildings, instead of siloing off one building at a time and having each of those buildings separately meet the emissions limit, a building owner can sum up the square footage of all their buildings and be held to a blended emission standard for their entire portfolio. And this is almost always going to be advantageous for building owners of multiple Berto buildings. If you're siloing off each of those buildings, a building that is above its emissions limit is going to need to purchase renewable energy certificates, make alternative compliance payments to offset just enough emissions to meet that limit. But if you're in a portfolio and summing everything together, buildings that are below that emissions limit are offsetting the inefficiencies of buildings that are above that limit. And so a building owner, by taking advantage of a building portfolio, may not have to take action and may have more runway before they need to do so. Individual compliance schedules. So this is basically reducing emissions in a building based on its own historical usage, right? So a building owner can use its own baseline year, anywhere from 2005 to 2021. Let's say there was a huge deep energy retrofit at a building back in 2018, and a building owner wants to take advantage of that work that had been done. They may choose 2013 as their baseline year, and then they draw a line from 2013 to 2030, say we have to reduce emissions by 50% by 2030 over that 2013 baseline, and then drawing a straight line from 2030 to 2050 to reach net zero by 2050. So, it's additional level of flexibility. It's a way to give credit for work that may have been done prior to the last few years. And I'll head into the last one here, hardship compliance plans. So this is, uh, really more all-encompassing to accommodate circumstances both foreseen and unforeseen with buildings. It may be that there's constraints with what can be done within the building. It may be that there's a financial circumstance that needs to be considered. Um, uh, there's basically, we want building owners to tell us why they're not able to move forward with this work. And that hardship compliance plan pathway is an opportunity to be able to do so. So yep, the applications for taking advantage of building portfolios, individual compliance schedules, and hardship compliance plans can be found on boston.gov/Berto, and they would be reviewed by the Berto Review Board, or the governing body within Berto. No application is needed to take advantage of a blended emissions standard. All right, next slide. Okay, so there are fines associated with non-action, failure to report, or failure to meet the emissions limit, and take action to then reduce emissions to meet it, result in fines. This ordinance does require time and effort, and in some cases it can be a bit of an expense, and so um, we need to be issuing fines to folks that are not taking action on this. We want folks to engage. We don't want to issue fines if we don't have to, but we want folks to engage with us, to show us that they're part of this process, and to work with us on this. Next slide here. Okay. Next slide. Okay, so early 2026, the deadline for reporting 2025 data is May 15th, 2026. So these next few months, we ask that folks really start as early as possible to request and report data, to assess whether or not, what action they need to take, right? So we do have a calculator that is linked to on boston.gov/Berto. Folks can report their data, go to that calculator, see where their building's emissions are relative to their emissions limit, and then they can work with us and take action to either buy mass class 1 RECs, make an alternative compliance payment, or take advantage of flexibility measures. Okay, so next slide here. All right, just noting some of the resources we have. So, we have a number of webinars coming up, but also, feel free to reach out to our team, energyreporting@boston.gov. And we plan to have sort of Calendly slots for folks to be able to go in and just schedule a 10-15 minute call with any of us, and get something on the calendar to dig a little bit further into your circumstance. So plenty of support, and this is all outlined again on boston.gov/Berto. Next slide. Okay, and we have a webinar series coming up. So next week we have a launch of Berto reporting webinar. We'll run through the actual reporting process, requesting data, and just entering data into Portfolio Manager and completing data through the Berto reporting form. And then we have a third-party verification webinar for verifiers the week after. And then a week after that, webinar on flexibility measures. So, and then we'll be having a few dates here for in-person workshops. So I would recommend on boston.gov/Berto signing up for our newsletter. That newsletter is how we communicate upcoming events, webinars, workshop series. So yeah, please take a look at that. Okay, I believe that's all from my end. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Aidan. Just a reminder to put any questions you have in the chat or in the Q&A. You can also feel free to ask at the end. But thank you, Aidan, for a great presentation. I'm briefly going to go over some of the other building performance standards in Massachusetts. So, of course, we have Berto in Boston. We have the Building Energy Use Disclosure Ordinance in Cambridge, similarly named Berto in Newton. And then we have the Large Building Energy Reporting, or LBER, in Massachusetts, which is pretty new. Talking about the buildings covered, generally in Boston, Aidan went over that in detail. In Cambridge, residential buildings or parcels with 50 or more units are reporting only. Non-residential buildings or parcels that are 25,000 square feet or larger, and municipal buildings 10,000 square feet or larger. Great reminder. Thank you, Ricky. There's also one in Lexington. I need to update this slide. We are running a little bit behind on time, and I can let you read the slide when we send out the slides later. But suffice it to say that these standards are becoming more and more common. And with LBER now, I think this is the second year of reporting. Buildings greater than or equal to 20,000 square feet have to report. So there are some key differences. In Cambridge, there's the requirement for large buildings to reach net zero by 2035 and allows the use of offsets starting in 2030. Newton only covers scope 1 emissions, so no electricity, and it starts with more gradual reductions than Boston and Cambridge, but ends up in the same place. And LBER is reporting only for now. And so one of the reasons that I think that Aidan's presentation and learning about Berto is so important, even if you're not located in Boston, is because it's kind of, we're seeing where these things are going and where Massachusetts is likely going, since Boston was so ahead of the game. So we're able to see these things happening in live time and kind of project them outward. And then there's the big question of, well, what are we going to do about it? Aiden went through some really great methods of figuring out compliance, but at the end of the day, we still need to make some major changes to buildings before hitting 2050. And Morgan is going to walk through decarbonization pathways and some engineering terms for us. So I will pass it to her.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about decarbonization pathways and different options that are available when you're looking at the long-term planning of your building and understanding what different things that you can do when it's time to replace your equipment or make some upgrades, or in this case, comply with different emissions reporting standards. We can go to the next. There are three major components when we talk about decarbonization pathways. There's energy efficiency, sometimes also known as energy conservation measures, which look at optimizing the efficiency of energy and water systems in the building and reducing the overall load. There's electrification measures, which look at converting fossil fuel-based systems to electric systems, and finally, implementing renewable energy, sourcing renewable zero carbon electricity to power the campus. This could be something like on-site renewables or other different options. It's often when we look at sorry, can we go back? When we look at these three measures, we often go energy efficiency measures, then electrification, then renewable energy in this order, partially because when you do energy efficiency measures, you reduce the overall load of the building. When you complete the electrification, you remove all the fossil fuels. And then finally, when you do renewable energy, you can offset or switch over to zero carbon electricity overall. Next slide. There are some common approaches when it comes to the timing of the implementation, and what we model are kind of cost savings analysis. We look at estimates for equipment replacement, annual operations cost, and regular maintenance cost, and any fines or fees associated with compliance. On the left-hand side, we have the business as usual case, where if you changed absolutely nothing about your building and replaced all of your equipment in kind, you often see the overall cost go up very gradually. This is partially due to the fact that utility rates continue to increase. And in addition, there may be potential greenhouse gas fines or compliance fees, resulting in that kind of overall increasing cost. On the right-hand side, we have the accelerated plan. This plan is if you were to do everything today, make all of your equipment replacements, all of your energy conservation measures, do that all today or very, very soon. Oftentimes, this does result in savings in the long term due to the electrification and reduction in load, but you're often replacing equipment that has a lot of useful life left. Finally, in the middle, we have the zero over time plan. This balances the benefits of replacing your equipment with electrified versions and the energy conservation measures with timing these equipment replacements with the end of life of your existing equipment. Next slide. Here we have an example of a zero over time plan. In this case, for this building, you can see the overall emissions, and the red dotted line is kind of that business as usual case that we talked about. So if nothing were to happen, this is what their emissions would be every single year and over time. As Aiden said, the grid is getting greener and greener. So it does go down due to the fact that the electric grid is becoming more and more renewable. We also have in the kind of light blue, the Berto's emission standard, and you can see how that decreases over time every 5 years. We've timed out in our zero over time plan with the different green markers, different measures that we would recommend that this customer implement in order to meet the 2050 net zero. Looking at this model, you can see that in the earlier stages, we recommend more weatherization, and energy conservation measures. And towards the end, as equipment reaches end of life, we recommend decarbonization and electrical implementation. At the very end, oftentimes we'll recommend alternative compliance payments, that's ACPs, or implementing clean energy or REC purchasing. Go to the next one. As Aidan talked about, there are some clients who are in this 2025 to 2030 band already over the limit. In this case, we might recommend something like paying the alternative compliance payments or class 1 recs, as Aidan described, as different compliance options in the short term to allow for more long-term planning. Things, as we've described, as building automation system controls, weatherization, and for the case of this client, a geothermal system. You can also see that further along the line, there are other equipment replacements that we've recommended. These are based on the fact that the rooftop unit in point 3 was fairly new. And so replacing a brand new rooftop unit with an electrified version didn't make sense. So we've staged it to replace this rooftop unit with an air source heat pump, fully electrified, in 2045 when the equipment reaches end of life. All right, next slide. So talking with engineers and these engineering design firms, there's a lot of different language that gets tossed around. Next slide. We'll talk a little bit about some of the engineering jargon that may be brought up. Things like construction documents, an energy audit, a feasibility study, and understand what some of those terms mean. Next slide. Oh, yeah. An energy audit is an audit, and an audit is a review of existing equipment and the building condition, oftentimes in person, to identify opportunities for those energy conservation measures that we just talked about. An LCCA, or life cycle cost assessment, is the financial analysis looking at the total cost of ownership. That includes the installation and long-term operation and maintenance under various scenarios as compared to the base case. What we talked about earlier is the business as usual. A feasibility study is looking at one specific problem or project and determining which of multiple approaches might be best. This can present multiple options at the end with the pros and cons of each approach. A decarbonization assessment, often paired with an energy audit, evaluates the existing building or campus to develop a plan for decarbonization and electrification. We often see an energy audit and a decarbonization assessment paired together, as many energy audit things like energy conservation measures pair well with decarbonization measures. Next slide. We have some more engineering jargon. This is kind of a diagram of the different phases of design. If you were to work with an engineering or design firm, you might hear some of these terms tossed around. Some of the important ones that we encounter are schematic design, or about the 20-30 to 30% design level. In this stage, it's appropriate for high-level planning and the budgetary estimating involved with a project. As we move towards construction documents, further along the design phase, there will be, at the end of this phase, the final documents that will be used for pricing, contracts, and construction. All the way at the end, after construction administration and the construction is complete, oftentimes there will be an optional post-construction services. This might be something like measurement and verification to ensure that the project, when implemented, is going as you expected. Next slide. We have some implementation examples. When we talk about energy conservation measures and decarbonization measures, we also want to talk about what those look like in terms of actual physical things. So energy conservation measures often look like building envelope improvements. Those can be window replacement, door weatherization and sealing, upgrades to the insulation or the roof. It can also look like building automation system control improvements. That can be lighting sensors, that could be occupation sensors to identify when a room needs to be heated or cooled, installing energy recovery ventilators. These are sometimes called ERVs, and upgrades to lighting. This can be switching out from fluorescent to LED or installing timers. It depends on the situation. Decarbonization measures often are looking at replacing existing fossil fuel systems and replacing them with electrified systems. This can be things like a heat pump conversion, either air source, ground source, or installing things like electric boilers. Also converting domestic hot water. Many domestic hot water systems are natural gas, so moving those to electric. In the case of multifamily housing or where people are living, appliance conversions are important too for decarbonization. Replacing natural gas dryers and natural gas ranges with electric alternatives, particularly high efficiency electric alternatives, can be a great way to further decarbonize your system. In doing these electric infrastructure changes, you often need to upgrade the capacity. This can be in anticipation of also installing renewables, or it can be to help upgrade the system for these electrifications like heat pumps. You may need to upgrade the capacity. Go on. There are no one size fits all solutions to building decarbonization. There are more standard things that can affect implementation or things that you might think off right off the bat, like the size of the building, the size of your equipment, the complexity of your system, or the budget that's available. There can be more unique requirements or procurement requirements. Things that we've encountered as unique requirements can be working with historical buildings. Those often present their own challenges in terms of what can and can't be installed, or any sort of changes to equipment placement, anything like that. So when you encounter these factors that might affect implementation, it could be a great time to phone a friend. So we'll discuss a little bit about when to seek expertise. As Aidan talked about earlier, looking at compliance in terms of reporting support, third-party verification, and hardship applications and individual compliance schedules. If you need assistance making those calculations or doing that kind of work, it can be a great time to ask an expert with those types of questions that you might have or help with those applications. When you reach the planning phase, when you're deciding, all right, we're going to do these things, we got to figure out when, involving an expert can be a great time, particularly for the energy and emissions assessments, and doing the evaluations of your existing equipment and building is a great time to involve an expert. Zero over time planning is another area where involving a design or energy firm can be a great solution. Lastly, when it comes to implementation, it is also a really good time to involve an expert. The procurement of renewable energy or those mass class 1 RECs, it could be a great time to ask an expert of what should be done, how many you might need, and the implementation of emissions reducing measures. Things like, as we talked about before, those energy conservation measures and decarbonization measures can be a great time to ask an expert on what should be done. All right. I will pass it on here to Craig, who will talk a little bit more about the financial and capacity building resources available.
Thanks. Thanks, Morgan. Everyone's favorite topic. How do we pay for this? So next slide, obviously, so the easiest is self-funding. That, it's where you have the greatest control and flexibility. It also requires you to have a little bit of a larger budget, but whenever possible, budget allocation, you really should be integrating decarbonization into standard capital planning rather than treating it as a one-off sustainability expense. The Green Revolving Loan Fund is a really great tool a lot of institutions have where you basically set aside some money into an account. And then as you invest in energy efficiency projects that do have savings attached to them, you reinvest those savings back into the fund to enable future investments. A lot of institutions also put their tax credits or their rebates into this fund as well to allow it to continue to grow over time. Again, really a great idea for certain institutions that can have that. A lot of universities have that type of system set up. Next, we'll move on to external funding, where it's really critical not to leave money on the table. So there are a lot of grants and tax credits and rebates from a variety of institutions. Certainly the mass saved utilities here in Massachusetts have a lot of rebates available. There are some federal tax credits for this work, particularly around energy storage and ground source heat pumps. And for a limited time, solar still has some as well. which does include nonprofit entities through the direct pay mechanism. As Eden mentioned, there's the Equitable Emissions Investment Fund in Boston. The Commonwealth also has some funding. I see LISC is here on the call. They have some great grant opportunities for multifamily affordable housing buildings. Um, and there's also fundraising. So asking for your network to pitch in to help contribute to these projects. I think, people underestimate how much fundraising can really be helpful on these things, particularly for mission-driven institutions. You can, position this around climate justice, health and safety, community resilience, to get your donors really excited about what otherwise might seem kind of boring infrastructure upgrades, to really make sure people understand the value alignment that's happening behind those investments and that giving. Um, Next is debt and performance-based financing, um, which basically unlocks a lot more capital if you're able to or willing to take on debt. So leases and loans are pretty straightforward ways to get additional capital. If you're more hesitant to take on risk, there are energy savings performance contracts, where you basically partner with an ESCO, and they shift the risk to that ESCO, which can help accelerate implementation, bundle different measures together, and they guarantee the savings there. It's important to note that for energy savings performance contracts, it doesn't fit well with all types of electrification measures. Some of these projects don't have a great return on the investment. And so you might need to blend that with other investments that do have that return of more traditional energy conservation measures. And then finally, moving on to power purchase agreements and energy as service models. This is where, if you're willing to be flexible around who owns the system, um, traditional power purchasing agreement, you can have you basically invite a company to come and install a renewable energy system, traditionally a solar system, on your property. They own that, they maintain that, they provide the upfront capital to build that, to finance that, and then they sell you that energy at fixed agreed rates, usually with a gradual escalation of that over the time period. And again, that really de-risks that investment, puts it on them, but allows you to lock in those benefits. Then there's also energy service agreements, which is similar to the energy savings performance contract, but with the energy savings performance contract, you have more fixed financial payments, and the energy service agreement is more variable. It depends on the actual savings that are realized as opposed to the projected savings that the ESCO would guarantee in that earlier model. And then finally, you have energy as a service, where you can actually transfer the control of a major asset to a third party, and in exchange, they took over the long-term operations and maintenance of that. Again, allowing you to de-risk that to some degree, and have more fixed payments around that. So the high level takeaway is that there's a decarbonization pathway. Lots of different ways to do this, different financial pathways, and ultimately the right funding stack is really a blend of self-funding incentives and probably some third-party capital. And I think with that, we'll pass it back over to Madeline.
Awesome. Thank you, Craig. I'm just going to head through a few resources, some that we've mentioned today, some that we haven't yet, and some upcoming opportunities and deadlines. So the Boston Retrofit Resource Hub is a fantastic place to go to look for resources on how to decarbonize. Specifically, I want to call out the Building Decarbonization Advisory Program, which is Boston only for multifamily, nonprofits, small businesses. And if you're eligible, it is a fantastic way to get started taking action on this. There's also an application for free reporting and verification support for certain building owners or tenants. So definitely look into that. Aidan mentioned the Boston webinar series in March. So if any of those webinars sounded like something you want to go to, we also put the links here. Cambridge also has a similar hub to Boston in terms of building energy retrofits. And then for Massachusetts at large, Mass Save is obviously a fantastic place to go. The Building Electrification Accelerator resources page is great, as well as Mass Interfaith Power and Light, which has resources for environmental stewardship assessments, zero carbon assessments, which is especially great for houses of worship. In terms of upcoming opportunities and deadlines, I always like seeing everything kind of in one place, in one list. So the MA Class 1 REC purchasing for 2025 emissions, that deadline's coming up on March 1st. Then there is the BERDO webinar series, which starts March 2nd. The BDAP cohort applications are due May 5th. The Equitable Emissions Investment Fund applications, I think, are TBD. Hardship applications are due later this year, and 2026 building portfolios and individual compliance schedules are also due in September. If you are not located in Boston, and so you're taking a look at large building energy reporting for the state, reports of energy usage due from utility companies and MLPs or municipal light plants are due May 30th, and building owners' information is due on June 30th. So now I want to make sure we have ample time for questions. I will keep the slide deck up for now in case we need to reference anything. But I'm going to start with the questions in the chat, if that sounds good to everybody. So the first one's for Aiden. So Lexington only has reporting right now, as previously mentioned, and will hopefully introduce required reductions at some point. When Boston came out with BERDO, were the required reductions part of the initial plan, or was that introduced later? And if it was introduced later, how did you roll that out?
Yeah, so yeah, the original BERDO was passed back in 2013, and a version of what we see today was part of it. It was to say it was called energy actions and assessments, and it gave folks three pathways. You could either, show that you've reduced your energy usage by 15% over a 5-year period, show that you're taking some sort of action towards getting an energy assessment or taking, doing work at your property, or you can prove that your building is efficient by getting it Energy Star certified. I think in the years leading up to 2021, when BERDO was amended, the idea that these building owners are responsible for the emissions in their building. We have a goal to be carbon neutral by 2050. How do we work in or amend a policy tool that orients those building owners towards 2050, gets them thinking longer term than they otherwise would, and gets them engaging more proactively in this space with energy professionals. And so, we're seeing that work. We're seeing these, BERDO really drive conversations so far. And, again, just getting building owners engaged in this way when they may not otherwise be sufficiently incentivized to do so. So as a policy tool, it's pushing folks in that direction. And yeah, I wasn't around before 2021, so I can't speak to the details as to just how much this was in play heading up to that, but that's the overview there.
Thank you, Aiden. Next question. Mary lives in a 55-unit condo building that's all electric. She signed up for a 20-year contract for electricity from a community solar farm in 2017, and that plan is no longer available to other tenants who didn't want to join at that time. She's wondering what options she should be thinking about or planning for when that 20-year contract ends. And I will probably ask Morgan or Simon to jump in on this.
Yeah, I can. Sorry, I was just taking a second to get off mute. I think. Well, first of all, I think getting the 20-year power purchase agreement, I think is a great first step, and it's really good that you're thinking about that and you were thinking about that as far back as 2017. So, great foresight on that. I think the the short answer is, you have, if I'm reading this right, that you had the original agreement in 2017. You're about halfway through that now. So starting to think about, what's next is important. Um, Specifically, I would say, continuing to look at what the power purchase agreements are, and if there is a follow-on agreement like that would be the first and easiest step. And I think seeing where the landscape of energy goes, especially energy procurement goes, it's really really changing and changing quickly. In the past even 3 to 5 years, energy costs are have been increasing. So I think that is an opportunity for people that can put on-site generation onto their building. Now, that might not be possible for you specifically in the condo unit there, so that adds another challenge there. But it could be an area to try to recommend or change some of the condo bylaws to allow for that, or to allow for people to to opt into that and find that. So I think that that path might be a little bit more challenging, but it could be beneficial in to pursue that.
Thank you, Simon. Awesome. And now anyone can take this question. If we know of any municipalities that have instituted green revolving funds.
I know a number of states have, like here in New England, I know Vermont has one. I know the New York City Housing Authority has established one. And then I know the city of Providence is, I believe, currently exploring that at the moment. And I think there are definitely some other municipalities that have it. I'm not familiar with as many specifics, but the Sustainable Endowments Institute is an organization that tracks this. I think they might have some more examples for you, Ricky. If you reach out to them, happy to make an introduction to them, if that'd be helpful.
Awesome. Thank you, Craig. All right, we've run out of questions in the chat, so please feel free to put more in there or put your hand up or unmute and ask a question. We have 7 minutes, so please feel free to ask anything you're curious about.
I have one for Aiden if we wait for folks to add others. Just for the portfolio approach, I've heard this question before, but if you have a non-Burdo eligible building that you own in the city, does that count toward your portfolio if you want to apply for portfolio compliance or portfolio reporting? Is that an optional thing, a required thing? How does that work? Does that make sense, Aiden?
Yeah. So really, it's just Birdo buildings that can be combined into that portfolio. Yeah, I think one great thing about compliance as a portfolio is that it better align with zero over time planning, that long-term portfolio planning, where you're maybe not putting together a plan for each building individually, but you're putting together a plan to decarbonize your portfolio. And so to have Birdo align with that is great. But yes, you might have buildings that are part of that plan that are not Birdo buildings. So there might be a misalignment there, but it's just the case that only Birdo covered buildings are part of that portfolio.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks.
I did want to mention one thing as well. So on one of the previous slides, there was the deadline of March 1st for purchasing Mass Class 1 RECs. So I should clarify that is the deadline at this time to purchase Mass Class 1 RECs through our Mass Class 1 REC Connector program, where we're partnering with an organization that is buying RECs on behalf of building owners. So if you miss that deadline, you still have the opportunity to purchase Mass Class 1 RECs and retire them for emissions compliance with Birdo beyond March 1st. And we definitely recognize that March 1st is right around the corner, and are looking at making adjustments within our regulations potentially to accommodate this and allow for that program, that offering, to extend beyond March 1st. But I can't speak to that timeline with certainty at this time. and the regulations process can take time. So, um, but I did want to clarify that March 1st date. That's for the Mass Class 1 Rec Connector program. You can go to boston.gov/Birdo and learn about that. But again, recs are available to purchase and retire beyond March 1st.
Thank you, Aidan. I just clarified that in the PowerPoint so that I can make sure that that's accurate before sending that out to folks. Another question we have is, do you have a sense for how many owners will choose the buying or retiring MA Class 1 RECs option, and how will that affect the availability of those RECs?
Yeah, this is definitely something that we wanted to make sure that we had a pretty clear answer on is whether or not the demand for RECs would have an impact on the cost. If the demand changes significantly enough and the supply does not change, then would that push up the price? But it is our understanding at this time that based on the estimated number of building owners that would be taking advantage of that pathway, as opposed to the number that are already meeting that limit or taking advantage of flexibility to meet that limit, is not significant enough to generate a difference in the availability or a significant difference in cost of Mass Class 1 RECs.
Yeah, I had to add a little bit there. I think generally it's true right now, at least, that Mass Class 1 RECs are cheaper than paying the ACPs. So as well, a few things, it's kind of a dynamic situation, but as the years progress and more buildings start to fall out of compliance and realize they need to do action, like as Aiden was saying, it's anticipated that that's somewhere between 10 to 15% this year, but in 5 years that number will change. Maybe more people use RECs as the pathway to compliance, and that may change the market. But then also as the years progress and the energy grid gets greener overall, that kind of diminishes the ability to use RECs, because not diminishes the ability, but they're buying just normal energy, electricity would be considered greener from an emission standpoint. So sometimes the effect of the RECs will decrease. Long way to say it's a little confusing and complicated how things are going to be affected, but just yet adding that context into what Aiden said.
Awesome. Thank you, Simon, for that long-term look. It definitely will get complicated, but so last question, I think, for today. Can a single individual invest in Mass Class 1 RECs?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, through that Mass Class 1 Rec Connector program that we have, again, currently the deadline is March 1st. Just be on the lookout beyond that date for announcements around any change to that timeline. Yes, that is really the best way for an individual to purchase Mass Class 1 RECs. If an individual, if they're a condo owner, really it's the condo association's responsibility to comply with Birdo, and make that purchase. But either way, going through that connector program is a much more streamlined process. The barrier to entry for all of that is much lower. So we would recommend that folks take advantage of that pathway. Again, Mass Class 1 Rec Connector program.
I'd also say, Mary, if you're interested as an individual, I don't know that RECs are really like something you can easily buy and trade and sell to make a profit off of as an individual. But if you're looking to buy them and retire them so that other people can't count them as credits, that is something that individuals can do and have done, where they'll buy the credits and retire them so that no one's getting credit for them. So that then, in theory, stimulates more demand for renewable energy generation, if that's your question.
Awesome. We are at 1, so unfortunately, I'm going to have to end this here. But thank you all for joining, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your day. And we will be in touch with the slides and recording.
Thank you all.
you.
Thanks, everyone.